Before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. So first of all attendees are in listen-only mode. Please do not turn on your video or unmute yourself during any time at the presentation. We will be recording this webinar, and so our recording and also slides will be given to anyone who registered for today's webinar in an email, and will also be posted on our drinking water training webpage, which is that link at the bottom. And please feel free to check out our website for any upcoming webinars and trainings, and also all of our previous webinars that we've done with this series. And we encourage attendees to ask questions throughout any time during the presentation. If you click on the chat feature, please direct your question to Q&A moderator. It's automatically showing, automatically show everyone. Please don't do that, or else everyone will see all of your questions. And yeah, so anytime during the presentation, we will have Q&A at the end of the presentations today. So yes, please send us questions. And then today's webinar, we have 3 presentations for you guys today. First, we have Dallas Shattuck for the EPA headquarters giving an introduction to DWSRF and any sort of climate resilience related eligibilities. And then we're going to have Kurt Baranowski, also from EPA headquarters, to talk about the CRWU program. And then we have Don Eisen, who's going to talk about additional climate related resources for utilities. And then, as I said, we're going to have Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please direct your questions to Q&A moderator. So now I'm going to hand it off to Dallas.
Thank you, Allison. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Dallas Shattuck at EPA, and I am going to kick things off by talking for a little bit about the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program and how we can fund climate change resiliency. And I'm just going to apologize up front for any coughing that you might hear through this. I will mute if that happens, but I am getting over a cold. Okay, so to kick things off, why are we talking about climate change in the context of water utilities? So changes in climate, like higher average temperatures and increases in storms, can significantly increase public health stressors like water quality and water quantity. So the operations, maintenance, and infrastructure of drinking water utilities can be threatened by these changes in climate. For example, like more frequent and intense storms that can lead to flooding and can impact the infrastructure, or maybe intense drought or sea level rise or saltwater intrusion. So because of all of these, changes in climate that are happening currently and will happen in the future, communities should consider ways that they can address those climate threats to their drinking water systems. And one of the ways, or one of the resources that communities could potentially use for some of their climate related projects or activities is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program. So how does this program work? So every year, Congress provides funding to EPA for the DWSRF program. And then at EPA, we divide that money up amongst the 51 states, the 50 states plus Puerto Rico, and we award grants to the states. And then they will provide a 20% match to those funds. And also at that time, when they receive money from EPA for the DWSRF, they can take what we call set-asides. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in detail, but they can take some of that money that they receive from EPA and set it aside in a different fund and use it for non-infrastructure activities. And you'll see in a graphic here a little bit what that looks like. So once states get their money, they remove any that they want for the set-asides, they put it in their revolving loan fund, and then they use that money to provide public water systems that come to them with applications, funding for projects for drinking water infrastructure. And then they will provide the communities, below market rate interest loans or other types of assistance, maybe like a grant or grant-like dollars for drinking water infrastructure projects. And once the community start the project, they incur costs. The states will reimburse the communities for those costs during construction. Once construction is completed, communities will start paying back those loans, typically over 20 to 40 year time frame. And those dollars that get returned back to the revolving fund are what we call recycled funds. And then those are used to provide new loans or assistance to other communities for other water infrastructure projects, which is where that revolving nature comes in.
Yeah.
Oh, somebody is not muted. So this is a graphic of what I've just described. I'm not going to go over it again, but you can see toward the top that there's this little bubble for the set-asides that don't go into the revolving loan fund. And I'm going to focus on those a little later on, but just so you can see the two main pieces of the DWSRF, the set-asides, and then the big square in the center, which is the loan fund portion. So who is eligible to use the DWSRF? We can provide assistance to publicly owned and privately owned community water systems or nonprofit, non-community water systems. So like schools, churches, publicly owned campgrounds, parks, entities like that are all eligible at the federal level. So federally, we say that those are eligible entities. There is a star on the top bullet. Just as a note that there are some states that do not fund private systems. They have state laws that prohibit funding of private systems. So in terms of projects that can be funded by the DWSRF, I think it's really pretty much anything you can think of in terms of drinking water infrastructure. So source, rehabbing wells, treatment, like building a new water treatment plant or adding new treatment for a new contaminant, transmission and distribution, including like lead service line replacement, storage, consolidations and other types of partnerships like regionalization, creating new systems in certain circumstances, and planning and design for any of the types of projects listed above. And now the set-asides. Again, so like I've mentioned, the set-asides are a very critical piece of the DWSRF, and they really reiterate the fact that not all drinking water issues can be solved with new infrastructure. So we could provide money to build a new water treatment plant, but if that community doesn't have a certified operator, or if they don't have money to pay back the loan, or if they don't have water rates structured properly so they can afford future operations and maintenance and future capital improvements needed for that infrastructure, then that water treatment plant is not going to be, a good long-term sustainable option. Again, and that's where the set-asides can help. So they provide non-infrastructure tools for states to help achieve the objectives of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So they complement the infrastructure financing, that loan fund portion of the program. They help states implement and strengthen their public water system supervision programs, and they also can be used to help implement preventative programs under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And very complementary and collaborative programs with the DWSRF. So like the capacity development program, the operator certification program, and the source water protection programs. So overall, states can take around 31% of that grant that they receive from EPA every year and keep that in that separate pot for set-aside activities. I'm not going to go over these in a ton of detail, but you can see that there's 4 different pots of set-asides. And if you add them all up, it's around 31%, but the first row, you'll notice there are 3 different ways that it can be calculated. So that's where the approximately 31% comes in. So in general, the top set aside we call the admin set aside. That's to administer the DWSRFs, pay for staff, office supplies, travel. The second one is for technical assistance to small water systems, which we define as under 10,000, and that can really be technical assistance for a variety of things, like applying to the DWSRF program, doing training for operators, helping with some non-compliance issues, trying to solve that, doing training for managers or elected officials, helping with federal requirements related to their SRF project. There are a variety of things that can be done. Like I mentioned on the last slide, we have a set aside the 10% that can help with other state programs like your PWSS program, and then like source water, capacity development, and operator certification. And then the last one we call the local assistance, the 15% set aside, and that can be used for a variety of source water protection, wellhead protection, and capacity development activities. And then really quick before I jump into climate specific discussion, I did want to mention the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was signed a little bit more than a year ago. It was a historic investment in a lot of programs at EPA, and it did include $50 billion to EPA for drinking water and wastewater programs. And of that 50 billion, around 30 billion, it's closer to 31 billion of that is coming through the DWSRF program. So there's going to be, in addition to the, I think around $2 billion available for SRFs, clean water and drinking water every year. We do have a very large influx of funding for the next 5 years. So there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of projects in states, including ones focused on climate, and also thinking about how we can incorporate climate resiliency into all of the projects that we're funding in addition to that. Okay, so let's talk about climate eligibilities. So under the loan fund, there are a variety of things that can be funded that are related to climate resiliency or have a climate component. And this is just an example list. This is not comprehensive. So some examples might be to establish partnerships or interconnections, or to incorporate energy and water efficiency, relocating or deepening your wells, like including aquifer storage and recovery, adding backflow prevention, conducting risk and vulnerability assessments, incorporating like resiliency and recovery into other infrastructure improvements. So like adding backup generators, purchasing saltwater resistant equipment, wind resistant equipment, and then doing like waterproofing and sealing of things at the water treatment plant. And then also planning and design of any of those activities would be eligible under the loan fund. And now the set asides. So these again are more things that aren't infrastructure specific, but can lead to infrastructure projects or can help systems be in a better position to address climate risk and be resilient to climate change in the future. So again, conducting risk and vulnerability assessments and planning and design. Those are unique. They have stars because you can fund those under the loan fund or the set aside. So that's what the stars mean. Typically, things are eligible in either the loan fund or set asides, but there are some exceptions, which I've highlighted here with little stars. A variety of source water protection activities, things related to drought, like drought monitoring, water loss audits, leak detection, conservation plans, drought response plans, training for water systems on, climate related topics, whether that's the operators, the managers, the elected officials, others involved in the water system, emergency response plans, tabletop exercises, business continuity plans, vulnerability assessments, implementing like state primacy agency responses to emergencies like SOPs and things like that. water reuse related activities, climate adaptation plans, and a variety of like other technical assistance that's going to help increase resiliency. And again, that is not comprehensive. Those are just some examples that I pulled like from state documents and fact sheets that we've done, but there are a lot of other things that would also fall under like non-infrastructure climate resiliency related assistance. And then just to wrap up here, I pulled a few examples of things that states are actually doing related to climate with their set-asides. So for example, Maine does emergency response tabletop exercises with their set-aside funds. They also use some of their set-asides to help implement their WARN, their like emergency response network for utilities. New Mexico uses theirs for water loss audits, water reuse, and then other sustainability assistance, including climate resilience. And New Hampshire uses their set-asides for a variety of climate change, vulnerability assessments, water audits, and energy audits. On this slide, I just have a bunch of links to some of our climate-related resources and fact sheets for folks to take a look at. And with that, I will turn it over to Kurt.
Thank you, Dallas. Much appreciated. Just give me 1 second here. All right. My apologies. Here we go. Thanks everybody for your time today. My name is Kurt Baranowski, and I work on EPA's Creating Resilient Water Utilities Initiative, which I'll refer to as CRWU. And what we do under the CRWU initiative is we're taking existing climate science data that's out there, whether that's from NOAA, through the National Climate Assessment, through other federal agencies. We're taking that climate projection data and we're putting it into usable formats for utilities, drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities. I know this is a drinking water focused webinar. However, I'm assuming many of you cross through all of the water sector capabilities. And so what we do with this data is put it into usable formats for utilities, water sector utilities, to think through what their potential future is going to look like, and then how do they adapt to that. So we've built this initiative out with many subject matter experts, all size different drinking water, wastewater utilities, many subject matter experts in the realm of climate impact, other federal agencies. So we've been working on this over about the past 15 years. And what I'm going to do now is give you an overview of some of the tools and resources that we have. And my contact information will be at the end. So certainly if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them during the end of this webinar or in the future. So the first tool that I want to introduce you to is our Resilience Strategies Guide. And what this does is an introductory or an onboarding tool for smaller and medium-sized utilities that maybe don't have a vast knowledge of climate impact, but want to start to consider it. So what the user does is come in, identify themselves, what type of utility they are, and then the area of the country that they're in. And that helps to actually start to provide information as it results to the data that you'll be provided as you walk through the Resilience Strategies Guide. So after you identify who you are in your area of the country, the tool starts walking you through and thinking through the different types of priorities that as a utility you might be concerned with. So as you can imagine, if you're in the southwest portion of the country, you're likely much more concerned with drought, although of course I understand that you might be also concerned with flooding with extreme events occurring the way that they are. If you're in the Northeast, you're more likely concerned with what is a warming trend as well as a wetter future. And so this tool allows you to start to identify those priorities so that you can start to think through what you might want to implement as a result of walking through the process. The tool also identifies what other utilities have done and provides you with a report at the end, which is nice because what you can do with that report is import it into the next tool that I'm going to talk about, which is our climate resilience evaluation and awareness tool, or CREATE. Before I move into that, though, as Dallas was talking about, and one of the really important things is, we can help utilities think through what their climate futures look like, and then, of course, how to adapt to it. But the real driver in all this is funding. So one of the things that we built into the Resilience Strategies Guide a couple of years ago were the identification of federal, state, and local funding sources to help to figure out how to finance those adaptive measures that are identified as part of going through the process. So I'll move on to CREATE. All of our tools are web-based tools. This tool, CREATE, is a true risk assessment tool for climate change for water sector utilities. The process itself is 5 modules, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's also very customizable. So we provide a tremendous amount of data in this resource or in this tool. However, if you have your own, what might be climate projection data or cost data, which I'll talk about that in a bit, you can override the information that we provide in the tool so that you can bring in your own, what might be alternate or potentially more accurate data as it relates to your utility. And the tool walks you through a process. I think what is a very logical process with a lot of help and tutorials built in along the way. We built this in again in coordination with many of our sector partners. And for any of you that were impacted by Section 2013 of the America's Water Infrastructure Act, the emergency response and risk assessment or vulnerability assessment aspects of that law. One of the nice things is if you've used VSAT, which is another EPA tool to walk through that process, you can take that, the result of that report and import it into CREATE so that you can start thinking through longer term from your natural disaster perspective, the climate impact on them as you identified it as part of the risk assessment for Section 2013 of AWIA. So these are the 5 modules that are in front of you. The first being climate awareness. Again, like the Resilience Strategies Guide, you come in, you identify who you are in the area of the country that you're in. And what the tool does after each one of these modules is you get a report. The first 4 modules, it's just a 1-page report, but importantly, in the climate awareness module, this is providing you with your climate data. So you see your projection data for 2 different time periods, 2035 and 2060. We're actually looking at new data as a result of the 2022 National Climate Assessment. So we're not only going to be updating that projection data, but looking at new time periods, which when we built this out originally for the 2035 time period seemed quite a ways away, and it's not so far away anymore. So we'll be taking a second look at those time periods. After you go through the climate awareness module, you go into scenario development. This is where you really start to think about your ultimate risk as it relates to your climate threat. Then you go into consequence and assets. This is where you think about, okay, I understand my threat better, what my future is going to look like. And now I want to think about the assets that are impacted by those. I think it's natural for many users to want to assess against every what might be threat asset pair. But what we try to tell users is think about that asset or a few assets that were lost or impacted by climate would significantly impact your ability to provide water or your customer base, and walk through the process, just going through that asset threat pair or pairs, and then revisit the process with additional assets. Also in this process here, you're thinking about the different types of consequences that the utility might be impacted by if this asset threat pair were somehow or another impacted by climate. So you're thinking about it from a financial and environmental, a public health perspective. And then you move into adaptation planning. This is where you start building out different or identifying different adaptive measures that you would want to implement as a result of the consequences and the assets and the threats that you identified in the first three modules of the tool. And then the last module of the tool, the risk assessment module, is where everything gets pulled together. You get a report that does a comparison of the different plans that you may have built as you've gone through this process, from what might be the low cost, low regrets type plan that you would be doing anyway, to something that might be much more progressive that you would implement over a 15, 20 year time period. And this is all based on cost. So all of the results that come out of Create are in dollars, which is important because, of course, that's the driver for all utilities of what the cost is going to be, what you can do. So a really important aspect of the tool. And the other nice thing about the tool is it also helps to identify, as a result of taking no action, what actual costs might be for the utility, which I think is an important piece for any user to better understand. So I really breezed through those two tools. We have much more information about those up on EPA's website and some training specifically on Create, and we'll point to that in a minute, but excuse me. But I probably haven't done them justice, but certainly both tools are powerful tools for water sector utilities. I talked earlier about some of the data that we have, and one of the things that I breezed over was some of the climate projection data that's actually built into Create, and I'll explain what that data is now. So when we first built out Create, a lot of people just wanted access to the projection data that was built into the tool. And so we mapped it out on EPA's website. So I'm going to walk through a number of maps that we have that provide all sorts of weather data. So this first map here is our storm surge inundation map. This provides information on hurricane strikes, storm surge along the Gulf and East Coasts, and the FEMA flood zones, as well as real-time advisories as it relates to hurricanes. So this is connected into NOAA's system, a really powerful tool. All these tools are built out on a GIS format. So you come in, you can see the little search bar here, type in your address, your zip code, and it'll start pulling up data as it relates to your utility. This map is all historic weather data, so there's no projection data built into that, but this is a really powerful tool for utilities to just better understand the here and now. So the data that's within Create is the climate projection data. So you can see here on this second pop-up the types of data we provide for two different time periods, as I mentioned earlier, 2035 and 2060. We provide information on temperature change, precipitation, storms, extreme heat, sea level rise. So all really significant information for two different time periods. We also mapped out stream flow projection data map on a separate map. Sorry, I popped over that too quickly, but and then we have two other maps. Recently, we issued a wildfire conditions map. So a lot of real-time data, which is really important to folks. So I would encourage you to go take a look at that. And then we also recently released a snowpack map. So again, I'm going over this all really quickly, but important information for any user to use when they're thinking through what their potential climate's going to look like and how to adapt to that so that they can continue to provide services. One of the other things that we like to do is to tell the stories of utilities that we've worked with, and I'll talk a little bit about our technical assistance and workshop efforts that we've done in the past, as well as what we're going to do in the future. But we have a case studies map, again, a GIS based map. We have 60 plus stories that are built out onto this map that all tell the climate experiences of these utilities, of walking through processes with EPA. You can see from the screen grab over to the right that there's quite a bit of information of various utilities and good geographic dispersion of the work that we've done over the past 10 years. We also provide technical assistance to utilities, direct technical assistance. So we do this in a manner where we do probably what are 3 or 4 virtual meetings with climate science experts and engineers, but then we also do on-site visits and we walk through the CREATE process individually with utilities. So last year we did this with about 25 utilities, and this year we're doing it with about 50, and we hope to continue to expand those efforts. And then we also provide virtual workshops, and in some cases in person, but of course with COVID, we went over to a virtual format. These are up on EPA's website, on our training website, which you'll get the link to later, so you can see the different trainings that we've done for the climate regions of the country. So if you look to the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see the different climate regions that are built out on the map. I'm not going to get into funding at all here because Dallas has already done a good job, but one of the points that I would make to all of you is, as a result of either conducting these workshops or the technical assistance work we've done, we're doing our best under the CRWU initiative to make connections into the different funding sources that are out there. So in the cases where we're providing direct technical assistance, we're bringing in the state people at the beginning of the technical assistance exercise so that they can understand what the utility is concerned with, and then help to walk that utility through different funding mechanisms at the end of the process. And then in the virtual workshops that we do, we're bringing in funding experts to talk about the availability of funds so that folks can better understand where they can gather up that not only that information, but hopefully begin to start the process to fund adaptive measures. And then the last slide here is just contact information. My contact information and the folks that I work with are over to the left. And on the right-hand side is the CRWU website. So all of that data that I provided earlier, all the tools, resources can be accessed very easily on the CRWU website. It's pretty simple to understand. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'll hand it on over to Dawn, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Dawn, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Kurt. And good afternoon, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So my name is Dawn Eisen. I work for EPA headquarters. I'm actually in the preparedness and response branch, and I'm going to be talking for just a few minutes on some of our climate related resources for utilities. So, Kurt was talking about, the adaptation, the data, trying to become more resilient. Our group kind of focuses on the, prepare, respond to recover from the incidents that the climate shifts are causing these more extreme events, the flooding, the tornadoes, the wildfires, the drought. And so our group is really focused on helping utilities prepare for those types of events, respond to and recover from them. So, we at EPA, since the America's Water Infrastructure Act, WIA was put into law, and well before that with the Bioterrorism Act, we've been working with utilities to assess their risk, and EPA defines that risk, and kind of to what Kurt mentioned too, as risk is threat times vulnerability times consequence. And so, EPA encourages all water and wastewater systems to plan for disasters that could disrupt system operations by conducting a risk and resilience assessment, even very small systems. Small systems, less than 3,300 community water systems weren't required to create a risk assessment or emergency response plan under OWIA, but, we highly encourage those small systems as well as wastewater systems to go ahead and do that. And to that end, EPA has recently launched a very small drinking water and wastewater system resilience continuing education unit program. So in this case, the Rural Water Association, RCAP, Rural Communities Assistance Partnership, will provide signed certificates to those systems who create risk and resilience assessments and emergency response plans that personnel could submit to their state or tribal operator certification program to receive CEU credit hours. So that's an important program that just launched and using the CEUs as a way to encourage those utilities, not just to get the benefit of the risk and resilience assessment emergency response plan, but also get some credit hours at it as well. So, and then once you assess your risk, you need to mitigate the risk. So once you identify risk utilities, you can begin to take action to mitigate that risk, such as in that photo that you see, raising critical components that are at risk of flooding. And, one of these things with this risk assessment, it ties nicely into Kurt and the crews creating, the CREATE program. So if you, find that you are at risk to drought or are at risk to wildfires, you can go further in depth into those risks by using the CREATE tool. So as far as EPA tools to assess and mitigate risk, we know that utilities are vulnerable to a variety of hazards. So we've developed a series of easy to use resilience guides to help utilities, again, prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate impacts. And some of the guides that I mentioned that we have are flood guide, a earthquake guide, a drought guide, and a power guide, power outage guide. And so, that may be a result of, say, a wildfire or an extreme event such as that creates a power outages. We have a power resilience guide. And while it might not be climate related, just because I wanted to make sure folks know about it, that EPA is doing free cybersecurity assessments for water utilities as well. So, we're only able to do a certain amount of assessments each year, but demand has been strong. So I anticipate those assessments will continue. And again, for small utilities, that cybersecurity is an issue across the nation. I know a lot of the smaller utilities, they don't necessarily have a cybersecurity program or use good cybersecurity practices. This is a way to get free assistance to take a look at their program assessment and a way to make some recommendations for them. So once we move on to the assess and the mitigate, we also, focus on emergency response. So I mentioned doing the risk assessment and emergency response plan. We've also developed an ERP template, emergency response plan template, that's easy to use for, help utilities create one if they don't have one. Dallas mentioned the mutual aid program, or WARN, which is the Water Wastewater Agency Response Network, which is basically a network of utilities helping utilities within a state before state or federal resources can come in. It's a program that is widely successful across the nation. Dallas mentioned that Maine uses their set-asides to help fund the WARN. I know Texas does as well, and I believe a few other states as well, which just goes to the importance of having that assistance before other help arrives. And utilities know utilities, they know the parts, components, the language. So it's much easier for them to help than, say, sometimes the state emergency management agency or the local emergency managers, depending on their background. They may not have a water wastewater background. So having people that can speak the same language is hugely beneficial. We also have instant action checklists. They're kind of a rip and run documents for all kinds of various types of hazards that are climate related. Again, drought, tornado, hurricane, wildfires, you name it, tsunamis. That it's like I said, it's a prepare, respond, and recover. That's the our motto that we use, and the instant action checklists follow that. And then we also have an app for actual response. So it's response on the go, ROTG. And you can do actual damage assessments real time. You can get contact information. You can get the radar information, and you can fill out. You do a damage assessment, take photos, email those to you. So it was designed with water utilities to help water utilities during responses. So what is recovery? So again, we're moving on to the recovery side of things. So what happens during recovery? Utility may be trying to make long-term permanent repairs. Utility may be installing mitigation measures to address risk and vulnerabilities. Utility may be upgrading the utility to comply with modern standards or to build interconnections between utilities. So, and another one, if water, wastewater systems get contaminated during a disaster, like with oil or other hazardous substances, the system may need to be decontaminated, may have to do, pipe replacement during the recovery phase. If flushing doesn't work, they may have to actually dig and replace pipe. Because recovery can be expensive, we actually created a tool called Fed Funds, stands for Federal Funding for Utilities, Water, Wastewater, and National Disasters. One feature of Fed Funds is that, utilities can answer a few questions. So if you, go to search for the right funding, if you click on that, you can answer a series of questions based on your utility, and it will provide potentially eligible funding opportunities for you because, private versus public, private nonprofit, small utilities less than 10,000, rural utilities versus cities, all of those have, different eligibilities for funding. So it's a way to kind of quickly pare down the different types of funding that is available. So, and then there's a bunch of, reimbursement tips, there's examples funding, and it's across the federal family of funding. So it's not just EPA, what Dallas mentioned, SRF is in there, the various loan funds and WIFIA, but we also have FEMA, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, the various public assistance grants, USDA, the ECWAG, and HUD, the HUD, and I think SBA may be in there as well now. And we're updating it to include all the new information that just came out from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then, we have so many different ways that we communicate all of these tools and guides, and we have substantial outreach efforts with email blasts, and we do frequent training, we do webinars, we do conference visits, trying to make sure we get the word out. So if you guys are technical assistance providers or your states and you're working with these utilities, they have, some of these issues that are coming up, or they haven't done a risk assessment, they haven't worked on a create tool yet, and something that they know, like out west we're having drought, long-term drought, no end in sight, climate adaptation strategies are necessary. We try to get the word out as much as possible, but we do these webinars so that we hope that you can reach out to those utilities as well. A couple of the we also do summary articles that talk about the various issues. So in Outflow, we've done a few different climate just recently, climate articles about flood resilience, about earthquakes, and the most recent one, I believe, June of last year, was about projects and funding to specifically mitigate drought. So I know we only have about 10 minutes, and we want to have enough time for question and answer for folks. And we have so many more resources that can assist the water and wastewater utilities to plan for, respond to, and recover from climate-related incidents. We actually have a hazard mitigation guide, and like I said, so many others that just can't be adequately covered in the amount of time we have. So I put our website on there. Feel free to check it out, see if there's any other tools that can help you, or if you're out with a utility that could help them as well. And with that, I believe I will turn it back to Dallas.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Thank you for all of your presentations. Yes, if you have any additional questions, please direct those questions to Q&A moderator and we can get that started. But in the meantime, while I have so many of y'all online, I'm actually going to launch a quick poll for everybody. And this just helps us make our webinar series better. And especially our last question, we're looking to see what kind of topics you guys would like us to cover in the next year. So I'll give maybe like a minute or two, and also for people to send their questions in. Alrighty, so while people are still filling out the poll and submitting their questions in the chat, I'm gonna actually get started. So I believe this question is for Dallas. Can you elaborate on the eligibilities for source water protection? It seems like there's a lot of funding that is going around to really help with water protection for numerous communities, and of course, enhancing the outcomes and resiliency for those water utilities. So yeah, can you elaborate on some of that?
Yep, sure. Good question. So again, source water protection is eligible under the set-asides. So not the loan fund, but there are still a lot of things that you can do related to source water protection under the set-asides. And especially with the large influx of bipartisan infrastructure law funding and the focus on source water protection, there's increased funding available for those activities. So the main categories of activities under the source water protection and the set-asides is, well, this is actually an interesting example, but under the 15% set aside, states can make loans to water systems for purchasing land or conservation easements for source water protection purposes, or to implement like voluntary incentive-based source water protection measures, like maybe riparian buffers or fencing. And those are very specific examples of where there's like a mini loan fund program in the set-asides. And then you can use it to do assess, delineate, update source water protection areas. You can do it, I'm looking at the language right now just to show you how broad it is. Implement efforts to protect source water. So that language is actually pretty new. It was implemented with a 2018 change to SIDWA. And it is very broad. So there are a lot of things that are related to source water protection that can be done. We've seen states do like well abandonment, cover crops, outreach and education, doing things related to septic systems that pose a risk to drinking water sources, local ordinances to protect source water, again, fencing, updating source water assessments, or implementing source water protection plans. There's really a wide variety of things related to source water. And I can put in the chat so everyone can see, we actually have a few fact sheets on source water protection that I can link to for folks who are interested.
Great, thanks, Dallas. And then I think this is a question for possibly like Kurt and also Dawn. What is sort of your advice or maybe your experience with utilities that may put up a bit of resistance to take action to build resiliency specifically towards like climate and natural disasters?
I'm sorry, this is Kurt. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so what's your advice or maybe your experience with utilities that may have some resistance to take action to build climate resiliency?
Yeah, that's always a tough one, but I think, what we tend to do is for those utilities that may be resistant to either assessing climate impact or whatever the scenario might be, is they're all experiencing more extreme events. So I think you have to kind of couch it from that perspective of whether or not you're dealing with droughts or floods or temperature, whatever it might be. It's gotten worse, and it's gotten a lot worse, let's say in the past 10, 15 years. So just from that perspective alone and the problems that they're dealing with today, I think you can, say to folks, it might be worthwhile to think about, this is your new climate, right? This is your new baseline. So maybe we ought to think about planning forward about how to continue to provide service And then I think as you're working with, or, from my perspective of working with a utility that might be resistant to climate change projection data, the uncertainty around it, I think you can start to introduce the concept of, or the information of the projection data. And because you're starting, already, like I said, with a sort of a new baseline than maybe you were even 10 or 15 years ago. And start to work on it that way of, okay, well, if it gets a little bit worse, then, what else do you need to be thinking about? So that's been my experience. Although I have to say, in all the time that I've been doing this, I really have not run into anybody that's, coming from a climate science denial perspective at all. Folks are relatively open to assessing climate and wanting to do what's best for their customer base. So I hope that helps to answer the question a bit more.
Yeah, I think so. And Dawn, do you have anything to add to that?
So I agree with Kurt. It's tough, and a lot of the smaller utilities. I know we have had some situations where they're resistance, and I think a lot of it is due to just time and the cost of things. So I think one of the things that we've done is to help encourage them, entice them, is things like the CEUs. So we know that all water utilities really need to do a risk assessment. They all need to do an emergency response plan. No matter what size they are. And, as Kurt was saying, these are happening more often. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And so, we try to give them things that will help entice them to do that. Dangle the carrot, I guess, per se, is say, hey, well, you're going to get CEUs if you do this. And hey, the benefit is you're, developing more resilience. One of the other things that we try to push is just the cost. The cost to mitigate is so much cheaper than the cost to recover, and dealing with it. So that's another avenue that we talk about. And with the funding that is available right now, especially for the smaller utilities, maybe some of the overburdened utilities that have, like I said, they don't have the funding. We have said, now is the time. If there's ever going to be a time, now is the time to get basically grants in some regards, principal forgiveness, depending on their eligibility, depending on the situation. There's a lot of available funding out there right now to help them so that it becomes something that's more attainable for them. And there's assistance out there to help them more than ever. Like one of the number one things we heard, we're doing a drought funding resilience project out in California with small utilities. And the number one thing we heard was they needed help developing the applications and getting the just proposals together, and they don't have money for the consultants. So we are working, EPA is right now got all of that money out to the various environmental finance centers to hopefully help do that kind of technical assistance. We're trying to create a list of some of the free technical assistance providers. That's one of the projects we have here for the beginning of FY23, is to develop a list of some of those providers out there that do provide some of that free technical assistance. Again, all ways to help them get it done, so it's not just them on their own trying to accomplish it.
Great, thanks guys. Dallas, I have another question for you. So I had a few come in that are similar. Are the eligibilities that you talked about with the SRF, are they similar for tribal and territories, or are they kind of different sources of funding?
Yeah, good question. So when the money is appropriated from Congress every year, when it comes to EPA, there is a certain percentage that comes like off the top, and that goes to our tribal program, our tribal drinking water program, and they work with the Indian Health Service to provide assistance to tribes for their water infrastructure. And then there's also a percentage that goes to the territories and DC. And that money will either go directly And that money will go to the regions. It's like EPA Region 2 in New York City, and then Region 9 on the West Coast. And then they will either directly provide grants to like projects that come to them, or they might send the money like to the territories, like environmental agency, and then oversee them picking the projects and providing the funding. So funding for the tribes and the territories happens outside of the SRFs. I will also say that tribes are eligible for funding under the SRFs. Historically, we haven't provided many loans or assistance agreements to tribal entities, though.
Great, thanks, Dallas. And then I have one more question for you. So public water systems need surface water filtration to comply with CIDWA. Engineering studies are related to planning, pilot studies, design treatments. Are those eligible under the planning to design funding, or do they need to have a specific climate resiliency component associated?
Good question. No, those would all be like planning and design activities, and you can fund planning and design activities either under the loan fund or the set-asides for any type of eligible drinking water infrastructure project. It doesn't have to be related to climate. That's just what we're talking about today. So those are the examples that I used. But again, it can be, you know, engineering studies and planning and design to address arsenic or nitrates, or do pilot studies related to something like that. It doesn't have to just be for climate.
Cool. And then Kurt, I have a question for you. So with the climate resiliency tool, the projections that it's based upon, do you have information about the assumptions?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, we do. So the data that's in there, most of it's built on the National Climate Assessment for 2018. And I think I mentioned that we're thinking about not only updating the time periods, but the data itself based on the 2022 National Climate Assessment. But the models that we use, the assumptions that we made are all built into Create's methodology guide. So you can take a look at that and really kind of dig down into the details of the data that we provide and how we provided it. We ground truthed all of that information with USGS as well as NOAA. So it's not as though EPA did this in a black box, because we don't generate this data. We're a consumer of this data and then trying to put it out to the water sector and everybody associated with it. So yeah, take a look at the take a look at the methodology guide. If you have any questions about how we provide the projection data, feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll be happy to talk to you about it.
Great. And then also, Kurt, how many communities does CRWU typically work with?
So we're trying to beef up our technical assistance capabilities. So last year we worked directly with 25 utilities, this year about 50, and I'm hoping that we can potentially double that even next year. So, but then what we also do through virtual workshops is provide larger training utilities. And of course, when we do this virtually, we can get to anybody. So last year, I think we got to about somewhere between 500 to 1,000 additional utilities through our virtual formats. This year, we're doing a really heavy focus on underserved communities. So we're working with a lot of tribal communities and then the technical assistance providers that service tribes as well as underserved communities. But all of the webinars that we provided last year have been captured and posted to EPA's website on that training page that I mentioned earlier, so you can access all of that there.
Fantastic. And then I have one last question. I know we're at time, but for Kurt and or Dawn, is fracking a part of the vulnerability assessment now? Like, is that a practice, or could that be a practice?
That's an interesting and timely question for me, because I'm working with the Mandaray tribe in North Dakota right now, and They're doing a lot of fracking out there and oil extraction. And one of the things that they're concerned with is runoff from those processes. So we're taking this extreme events that are occurring out there. So, they go through these drying periods and then they get these extreme floods and then the runoff. But the fracking isn't the driver for the climate assessment. It's just it's a result of what they're doing out there. So fracking isn't being driven by climate impact. However, the runoff and what occurs downstream is. So on some level, we're addressing that, but I would not say that by any stretch of the imagination are we addressing the climate fracking nexus as it relates
Not be on my computer, Ali.
Sorry, you have to put yourself on mute, folks. I'll hand that back to you.
All right. Well, that is all we have for today. Thank you all very much. As a reminder, we will be sending slides out to all who have registered. And we will be posting a recording on our drinking water training webpage. Again, a special thank you to our presenters today, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.